Alright, welcome to Mike's Miniature Workshop, and today we're gonna paint something for my army on parade. So, playlist in the description below if you wanna see the whole thing. We built already a diorama, we picked an army, we decided what colors we wanna use, and today we're gonna test it on this fella here. We're gonna paint Eternus. He's gonna be the general for our army, at least for now, because maybe we get something a little bit more fancy down the road. Now, keep in mind that this is for a competition and I'm a hobby dude. So yeah, this is gonna be great. For me, this is more about having some nice minis, having fun on the table, but this time for the army on parade in my local Games Workshop store, by the way. No, I'm not participating with the big boys. I still wanna give it my best. Also, I wanna learn a few things, so we're gonna focus today on bones and leather. Should you be interested to copy this for whatever reason, you can find all the paints that I used in the description below. Let's see what I can produce in a limited amount of time and some deadline pressure. Let's get going. So first things first, let's have a look at the content of the box. Not too many pieces, which is not a big surprise since we only have one model. I take some clippers to separate the pieces from the sprue. Just be careful to not cut into the wrong area. Once that is done, I scrape off the leftovers on the pieces. You can do this with your hobby knife or with a file. You should also check for mold lines, especially on important areas like the weapon. Mold lines seem not to matter too much, but once you slap some paint on it, especially shades, they stick out like a sore thumb. After a while, I cleaned all the pieces. What you could do now is washing them in some water with a drop of dish soap to get rid of any dirt and oils. It's not super necessary, but it can help your primer to do a better job. Next step is gluing. However, I like to paint my miniatures in segments. That means I glue together parts that can be painted easily afterwards. Let me give you an example. Painting the saddle of the horse, once you place the rider on top, it is quite challenging. Painting the inside of the legs from a horse, once it's assembled, is not a fun thing to do either. Or painting armor after gluing the shield on the arm. Now all of this has pros and cons, and we will definitely see them in this video. But I have to be honest to myself, if I want the highest quality paint job for the model, considering my mediocre painting skills of course, then I have to paint some elements of the mini before gluing everything together. Next part of the process is to drill some holes. Look for thicker parts and areas that you will not see later. I take a 1mm hand drill. If this is not possible since the pieces are too thin, I use a toothpick and some of this cleaning paste. Honestly, you're looking for something that is sticky but can be removed afterwards without leaving any stains. As long as you're not pushing with your brush like the Hulk, this will do fine. Next up, we're gonna roleplay as Vlad the Impaler and skewer all pieces on some wire that is attached to a cork base. All of this is very cheap and I can reuse it multiple times. Awesome! Just be careful that you don't handle the cork over your wet palette, because otherwise some of the cork crumbs will inevitably end in your paint. We are doing all of this so you don't have to touch the parts too much. I like to paint without a glove to feel the mini, and although I have some very dry hands, touching paint repetitively over and over will damage it at one point. Gaps will be closed with green stuff. Then take care of the excess material by grinding it down with some fine sandpaper. In my humble opinion, Drakenhof, that's the name of the horse, looks like a unicorn. The horn looks like the house of a sea snail. So I create something that resembles a horn made out of ice. There are lots of ways to make icicles. My latest method is some wrapped tinfoil. Glue it on a toothpick, cover it in superglue and let it dry. I clip off the original horn and look for a fitting ice replacement. Once I have a fitting one, I make the base a bit bigger. Just crunch down on it with your tools. Be gentle though, you don't want to break it. I use some green stuff to get a good connection between the tinfoil icicle and the head. This takes a while. If it looks uneven, it's perfect. Ice doesn't really have a specific shape. Once I did all of this to all the parts, I primed them. A simple black with a white zenithal highlight. The preparation is now done and we can get started. Not gonna lie to you, this took me a few hours. Honestly, it's up to you if you want to have the whole model assembled or not, and everything has a pros and cons. I might do a video about that at one point. But I am, with my skill level, not good enough to paint behind shields, and also I find it very obnoxious to do that. So I'm gonna go with this step-by-step process. Now I have mixed my own paint for my army. It's a mix of Lead Belcher, Incubi Darkness and Zotic Green. I explained how I did that in my How to Pick an Army video a few weeks ago. It should pop up in the top right if you're interested, otherwise you can just check out the Army on Parade playlist for 2023. I applied 2 thin coats. Honestly, if you're not the best painter, like me, this is probably the way to go, since it gives you way more control over what's happening on your mini. I try not to hit any other parts, but if it happens, no big deal. Since your paint is so thin, you can paint over it later. As long as you don't try to paint over it with white. In general, it's best to start painting with the lowest parts of the mini. There are exceptions, for example if you plan on dry brushing something later. Parts that need dry brushing should be done first. Now you can see that 1 coat on the armor plate is not enough. Let's put a second one on it. That looks already much better. I think I keep it that way. Now I'm gonna use a shade, Drakenhof Nightshade. I apply it on all parts painted in Frozen Death. Just avoid pooling and push the color into the cracks and recesses. Basically anywhere natural shadows would appear. The Zenithal highlighting should help you with that. So far nothing of this was very difficult, just time consuming. Let's go to another easy step, dry brushing. I use here some Runefang Silver. I want my metal armor to look like metal, and it's definitely missing the shine that metallics normally have. Dry brushing is simple and gives us the desired effect. Of course you could do all of this with a non-metallic metal style, but dear god that would take too long. And that's also not very easy. Dry brushing is simple. Get some paint in your brush and then get most of it out by brushing over, honestly, whatever you have available. I just use a piece of cardboard. You can get a dry brush palette, I actually own one today, but it's really not necessary. Once there's almost no more color on the cardboard, I test it a final time on my skin and then gently, really gently brush over the metallic surface. Be careful with this, you can always put more paint on by more dry brushing. Those are the only 2 rules with dry brushing, very little paint and gentle strokes with your brush. You can already see the difference between the dry brush piece at the bottom and the top part where the paint is still missing. My goal was a dark, cold steel, and I think we achieved that. There are more metallics on the piece and I keep it simple for them. Dark metal color of your choice, some Nuln Oil afterwards, and then dry brush or highlight the top parts with something bright. So for example, if you use Citadel colors, you can go with Lead Belcher, Nuln Oil and Runefang Steel. Done! Now to the horse. Keep in mind that most of the skin of the horse will be covered by armor. And since I have only a limited amount of time before I have to turn it in for the competition, I try to focus on the most visible parts. I paint the horse completely black. Afterwards, I give it a coat of Drakenhof Nightshade. You might think, dude, it's black, why put a shade on it? Let me show you. The shade gives it more life and really starts to shine. The regular black right next to the shaded black shows this nicely. Of course, it's up to you if you want that effect or not. Next, I'll do the ornaments on the armor. I mix my own metallics for that. I use Kabalite Green with Emerald Alchemy from scale 75. I think it's the only non-Citadel color I use in this video. I'm really happy with the scale 75 stuff and I swapped most of the Citadel metallics with their product. They are in my opinion just so much better. Citadel has some decent ones, like for example Liberator Gold, but scale 75 feels a bit more easy to use. However, the paint doesn't cover very well, mostly due to the Kabalite Green that I'm using. So we will do a second coat. And the second coat gives me almost 100% coverage. I take it. Now before we do the highlights on the ornaments, I want to get this oxidation effect going. This is inspired by the box art and Warhipster, a fellow YouTuber. He painted a stunning Eternus himself, maybe you want to check that out. He was a great inspiration for what you're about to see. First we're gonna thin down Zotic Green. We will dilute it down heavily. I'm talking here about a 10:1 mix of water to paint. I dip my brush into the paint and roll it over a paper towel. You want basically a glaze consistency. As you can see, there is almost no paint on my fingernail. The technique is really easy, but it's time consuming. I apply this now between the ornaments and the blue steel. Here we have our first application of 1 layer. Then we have 2 layers. And then I stopped at 3. It really depends on how strong you want the effect to be. I paint this on all armor parts. And yes, this was not really fun. I probably prefer painting a model in complete white tones before doing this again. The next step is to repeat the process with Drakenhof Blue. As you can see here, I have way too much paint on the brush. As long as you react fast, it's not a big deal. Wipe off your brush and soak up the excess water. I got impatient with the step honestly and used a bit more paint and let it run between the ornaments and the armor plate. You can push the paint into the recesses, and here we are after 2 coats. Again, I want the effect not to be too strong, and I was way behind schedule for the deadline. So I stopped here. Really loving the effect of cold and oxidized steel, and although it's time consuming, it doesn't need insane skills to do this. You just need to be precise and manage the right amount of paint in your brush. Next up, let's paint the inside of the mouth. I started playing a base coat of Mephiston Red. I highlighted everything with Evil Sunz Scarlett. You can of course start to debate how much detail you want to put inside a mouth that nobody will ever see. Always keep in mind that people look at your minis from normally half a meter away. But I want to get practice, and I thought a few details here would be neat. I edge highlight everything with Emperor's Children. It is very bright compared to the rest of the tongue, but I think it looks cool. It gives the tongue some texture and gives it a good pop. Now, as I said in the intro, bone is something that I would like to focus with my army. Now, bone is something that you can paint very easily. You take Ushabti Bone, then you shade it, then you dry brush it again, a few highlights, done. I want to try something today, and that is the method that GW is teaching in their Warhammer Plus subscription. I changed, I think, 1 or 2 colors, but the method stays the same. I hope I don't get in trouble for this. But that's what painting videos are for teaching and for learning. And for me, it's gonna be like a mix. And it's honestly not that difficult. Well, you will see that my first attempt with the claws is probably not that great. But honestly, after a couple tries and, finishing the claws and the teeth, I was kinda pleased with that. I know you have to be careful with telling the internet that you're pleased with something, because people get mad at that for some reason, that you're happy about something. The only thing that completely derailed during this project was the time frame. So I had to cut a few corners, but you know what? I'm gonna talk about that in a few minutes. First layer is gonna be Rhinox Hide. You put that on every part of the claws, teeth, skulls, everything you want to do in a bone theme. I try to showcase it with the claws of Drakenhof. Once you're done with the first coat, take Mournfang Brown. Try to paint triangle shapes into the previous layer, and then you fill the following triangles with less and less paint. This is very hard to do the smaller the piece is that you're painting. After Mournfang Brown, we're gonna take XV88. First feedback to my past self would be that the transitions are too clean. I figured it out later during the whole painting process. You have to start with something, am I right? This was literally my first try doing this. Afterwards, we take some Zandri Dust. Then I took Balor Brown. It's a slight deviation to what GW is using, but honestly the whole idea is to take colors that fade from a dark brown to white. What exact colors you use is up to you. Once that is applied, we take Ushabti Bone. With bigger parts I added some Screaming Skull before going to a dot of white. I was considering giving it all a Rhinox Hide glaze, but for now I decided against it. I really like the white spot at the end of the claw. According to GW, you can do it also the other way around. I didn't try that yet though. I did the same process with the teeth. And boy oh boy, I can't tell you how happy I was that the head of Drakenhof was not glued together, because this would be an absolute pain in the butt to paint. I also did the same technique with the tail. And I don't want to brag, but just after a bit of practice with some claws and teeth, I started to get the hang of it. I think what's important here is that I broke up the final highlights, Ushabti Bone and pure white. For example, I painted white at the raised parts of the middle bone, interrupted it for a bit, and then put some white again at the end of the single spikes. Once the teeth were done, I removed the makeshift bases and glued the head together. You have to be really careful to remove any excess glue. I have some foam to protect the colors while holding everything together with a clamp. The absolute mother of this piece was Drakenhof front armor. You can see it after Rhinox Hide and Mournfang Brown. I did the horns at the same time. Next up was XV88 again. And Zandri Dust. Balor Brown into Ushabti Bone and white. You know the drill by now. The key element is to consider where light would hit the piece. The first colors are easy, just reduce the surface little by little every time. And use thin paints. My dear lord, use thin paints. This will get a mess otherwise. And here we go. I'm quite pleased with the horns and the front armor plate. Sure, there's still room for improvement, but I think there's always room for improvement. All the bones on the mini took me roughly 10 plus hours. Always keep in mind that practicing new techniques for the first time is always time consuming. And what would be better than learning new techniques while you paint for a competition? Am I right? Let's jump back to the armor because we didn't finish that yet. I used the greens from my color theme and mixed them all with Emerald Alchemist. We're gonna resume our highlights and mix the Emerald Alchemist with Sabarite Green. The difference between the non-highlighted piece on the left compared to the highlighted piece on the right is very subtle. I promise you that it's mostly the camera doing a bad job capturing the footage. Definitely not my crappy painting skills. The final edge highlight is a mix of Emerald Alchemist and Gauss Blaster Green. No idea how to pronounce that if I'm honest with you guys. The only difference between the two highlights is that the Sabarite Green covers all edges and the Gauss Blaster Green only the ones hit by light. Now comes a sentence you heard already a few times and I promise you it won't be the last time. We are running out of time. I think with the armor and the bone parts we have quite a few eye catchers. All the other metals, such as chains, get a dark metal color, non-oil and a bright metal color as a highlight. For example, Lead Belcher and Runefang Steel. Just pick whatever you have at home. The hooks are getting a brass paint job and the remaining skulls get an Ushabti Bone base color, skeleton horde contrast paint, a dry brush of Ushabti Bone and a highlight of Skull White. Still quite a few steps, but that bone recipe is so much faster compared to what we did before. Only a few more days before the deadline for the competition and I had just way too much left to paint. So I would skip a few parts of the horse. Yep, you heard that right, I skipped a few areas. It was a sacrifice I had to do, otherwise the mini would never ever be finished for the deadline. For the next steps I used Incubi Darkness, Dark Reaper, Thunderhawk Blue and Russ Grey. The idea is to focus on a few parts that would look very weird with only the black. Raised areas such as hair, fur, stuff like that would get a nice paint job and the rest stays black. Most of it will be covered by armor. With more time, I would pick out all the muscles of the horse and would just be so much better. But well, not much I can do here. Maybe I go over a few parts after the competition is done. Let's paint a few things that people will definitely see. Leather. I start with a base coat of Rhinox Hide and Dwarven Brown. I apply multiple thin coats on the saddle parts but also the cloak. Now, just once more, I picked the cloak over the flag stuff because I wanted my Eternus to blend in with the rest of his army. They all have leather cloaks and I wanted everybody to be uniformly dressed. Next up, we shade the cloak. Rhinox Hide with Abaddon Black and a crap ton of water to create a glaze consistency. This was my first time painting leather, again following a GW tutorial, and I just put the glaze everywhere where I thought shades would occur. I tried to keep the shadows light at the top and more intense at the bottom of the cloak. I edge highlighted everything with Dwarven Brown. Then with Scrag Brown I tried to stipple a little bit of texture on the leather parts. This should give all pieces a worn and battered look. That was surprisingly easy with the saddle, but painful with the cloak. Highlighting everything with Dwarven Brown and also getting the edge highlight with all the folds in the fabric, yeah, that was kinda difficult. I like the experience to know where to put all the scratches too. It was a good practice and the end result looked okay, but I was not 100% happy with that one. You will see that at the end because my recording got corrupted. Yay. An awesome general needs an awesome base. The issue is that I knew some of the base would have a bit of waiting time, since glue and other stuff needs to dry. So I had to do this now just 3 days before the deadline. Although I could hear the clock go tick-tock, tick-tock, I still did a rough planning of the base. Honestly, nothing is worse than making mistakes, and in the end you lose even more time because you have to redo certain steps. Since I just returned to the hobby, my bits box is basically non-existent, so I had to get some help from my 3D printer. Skulls, broken weapons, branches, stuff like that. You really do not need a 3D printer for most of the parts. There are a few bits that are special though, and you can't replace them. You can craft them yourself though, but that's time that I don't have right now. I wanted my Eternus to stand in front of a frozen stream. Has to be a small stream obviously, since the base is giving us only limited space. I also needed some ice shards. I took some of my UV resin, put it on some plastic sheets and dried it with my UV lamp. I did a few clear ones, but I also mixed some white into some of the shards later. Afterwards you can peel off the resin and cut it into tiny pieces. Done! Now I have to wait for the PVA glue to dry, so let's paint Eternus himself. While I wait for the glue to dry, I apply all the base coats on his right arm. We take our Frozen Death mix for the armor steel. The handle of the weapon is painted in Naggaroth Night. I'm a bit excited, but also afraid of the color purple. Purple can be associated with royalty and nobility, so it makes sense for a leader to have it. The pole gets a dark metallic. I keep this simple, the focus will be on the blade anyway. And that part will be base coated in black. Yep, black. We will need that for our frozen weapon theme. The ornaments around the blade will be gold. Then I take Caribou Crimson and shade the grip. The PVA glue is now hopefully dry enough for further processing of the base. Here you can see the difference between the clear and the colored resin. I like the non-transparent resin a bit more, and I think in the future I will play around with a few more colors. So I clip that into tiny fragments. Careful though, this stuff gets launched far if you don't cover it with your hand. And believe me, you don't want any resin darts in your eye. Not the bullseye you're looking for. Next up, we rough up the surface of the cork. We have to give it a more natural, rocky texture. Once that's done, I use some putty to get rid of all flat surfaces. I also glue my bits on the base now and then blend it into the piece using said putty. In hindsight, the cork shouldn't touch the border of the base, since you want some space where you can place the putty. This step is absolutely necessary though, to hide the different layers of cork. Before everything dries, take your model and give it a rough placement testing. One of the ice shards is a bit close to the horse, but it should be fine. Now we need to wait for this to dry, so we jump back to Eternus. Should the guy who sculptured Eternus see this video, for whatever reason, I'm sorry. It's a unique model, but I can't help it. It looks like the dude tripped into the bits box of the sea. So many sea snail shells. Why? So I changed the chest piece and the head with some elite pieces. Now I have one issue. None of these parts really fit together. So I had to put everything together with green stuff, and boy, always do this before you start painting. I'm a dumbass and this was very frustrating. You also run into the risk that the rider doesn't fit on the mount anymore. Imagine after all this effort and time you can't glue them together. While my Frankenstein Eternus dries in the corner, the putty is ready to get painted. I primed everything black and gave it one coat of Abaddon black. Now comes a very fun and satisfying part, giving it the rocky color. First I dry brush with a mid grey. Have to admit I use Stonewall Grey from Vallejo, just take a similar one, it isn't really important. Afterwards I use pure white and dry brush over the sharpest edges. Don't skip the white part, it's in my opinion a super simple step and elevates your paint job with almost zero effort. I'm not gonna go into too much detail with the base. I applied base coats, shaded them, highlighted them again and finished with an edge highlight. People sometimes ask me why I never stream my painting session. I paint in my kitchen and very often I'm not alone. My kids join the painting sessions to criticize my work and to have some very deep conversations.
Und die Rehe kommen mit ziemlich langen Beinen an, damit sie schneller laufen. Vor den Jägern. Nee, von einem Pistolenschuss kann nicht mal das Reh weglaufen. Kann ein Gepard von einem Pistolenschuss wegrennen?
Nee.
Okay. Weil der Pistolenschuss ist schneller.
Yep.
Okay.
Now you saw me apply watered down white to the crystals. I use Skeleton Horde on the skulls. The white on the crystals should be dry now. So let's paint eyes. This is inspired by Pete the Wargamer, another fellow YouTuber. He made a tutorial for frost weapons and it heavily inspired the way I paint my frost effects. I basically use contrast paints and paint the ice shards. Lighter colors at the top, darker colors at the bottom. You can also dip into a few green tones if you feel like it. Or go absolutely fantasy on the shards and paint maybe an orange or red eyes. Why the hell not? It's a fantasy world for a reason. Kind of a shame I didn't do that actually. While I wait for the contrast paint to dry, I dry brushed the skulls with Ushabti Bone. The contrast paint wasn't fully dry yet, so I painted the riverbed with Kantor Blue. This will take a while to dry, so let's do a step that is quite time consuming, but I would never ever dare to skip it. Load some pure white into your brush and stipple over all the edges of the ice shards. You can be quite random here, it's fine. Just make sure that the tips and connection points between the edges are white. Once that's done, you can paint some scratches on the shards to give them an even more realistic look. Now let's do something fun. Use different blues and greens and water them down. I think I used Lofive Blue, Zandri Green and Drakenhof Blue. And all you're doing now is wet blending. Mix the colors together. That's why it's so important in this step to water down your paints. You don't want them to dry too quickly. The water itself will create some swirls and you know what? That's fine. While I wait for this to dry, I pick out some highlights on the skulls with Screaming Skull. Next we take our UV resin again and apply a thin layer on the river. Don't worry, the surface tension is strong enough so it won't run off your base, as long as you don't tilt the base too much. Next up, I positioned my ice shards to give the stream a frozen look. Now in this recording, I glued tiny pieces under the shards so they stayed in a tilted position. This is overkill though, just place a drop of UV resin, place the shard and hold it in place and dry the resin with an UV torch. You live and learn, I guess. Once I have that done, I give the whole river a white dry brush. You could also do a very light blue, or both. So far I'm quite pleased with the result. Now I take one of my heavy duty brushes and place some PVA glue in all the locations where I think snow would gather, or where I needed to hide mistakes. The base of the ice crystals and the borders of the frozen river are ideal for this. Once this dried, I brush off the excess powder. Use an old brush for this, because you don't want to find still wet glue with your fancy brushes. A lesson that I learned the hard way. So let's give that a bit of time to dry properly. Alright, let's go to the weapon. It's the same technique that we already used while we painted the crystals. Black base coat and then some thinned down white. Do the same with the horn. Our special aluminium, non-crab shell like horn. I applied 2 coats of white. It will not be 100% opaque, but that is okay. We don't need that. Once that is dry, I apply again the contrast paints very sparingly. There's one thing you must avoid with this technique, and that is the pooling of paint. That happens sadly a little bit to me. You will otherwise have some weird blobs, and ice normally doesn't have that. I play around with different blues and greens again. I think you get it by now. Once that is fully dried, don't be impatient. You stipple on the white and add scratches. The armor of Eternus gets the same treatment as the horse. Frozen death, shaded, brush it and then oxidation effect. Once that's done, I paint the gold parts. I use scale 75 for that one, but the recipe can be done with Citadel paints too. I used Dwarven Gold for a nice base coat. 2 coats were needed. Easy peasy, but just don't hit the blue armor parts, otherwise you will cry. Patience is key here. Wait, how often did I say that in this video? Yeah, patience is good for painting minis. Dropping all the crazy wisdom here, I know. Once that base coat is done, I shade it with Reichland Flesh Shade. I applied it a bit generously. Then I go back to Dwarven Gold again. The Reichland stays everywhere where I think there would be shadows. Once that's done, I took Elven Gold, a brighter gold. I know, shocking. And painted everywhere where the light would hit the armor. And then at the end, I use Runefang Steel to edge highlight. And that is how I paint currently all my gold metallics. Looks decent and you don't need any crazy skills for that. If you don't have the scale 75, you can just take Liberator Gold and maybe Auric Armor. At the end, I decided to edge highlight the coat with some Carrick Stone, really just the extreme areas. And then I blend everything together with a Rhinox Hide glaze. I finished a few parts here and there, but honestly nothing too crazy. I think I added a few brighter purples on the grip to give that a little bit more pop, but otherwise I think we're good to go. And with that, we're done. Let's have a look. And yeah, that is my attempt at Eternus. So let's talk about that for a minute, or maybe two. So with the base, I'm actually pretty happy. Of course, you can still improve there, and this is probably what annoys me the most is I played this dude now already twice, and he looks decent in my opinion, but a few parts, like Dracocephalus, I wish I would have painted there a little bit more. Like, looks nice on the table, but closer inspection, we still have a long way to go. The leather coat is decent, the same with the fur and everything that I painted in these dark blues and grays. I'm happy with that. The bone, I'm really pleased. Like the horns, the front armor plate, that is cool. The leather effect is cool. Like the gold recipe for the gold metal, that is kind of nice, so I'm happy with that. As always, more time. I think I spent in total a little bit over 60 hours on that thing. Main issue was looking up a lot of things, getting inspiration, trying it myself, correcting stuff. Whenever you do something for the first time, it's a pain in the ass. And since this was for a competition, you probably would like to know, well, how did we do? And we won that one. I think there were 4 or 5 entries. And of course, you always have to keep in mind, this is for local games workshop. I know I have to say this a bazillion times. This is nowhere near Golden Demon. This is just some dudes doing this for fun. I learned a lot with this mini, and I think that was the most important process here. So, bone, I think I have now a recipe that is time consuming, but I think I can do this fast in the future. I also have one more mini that we will show in a video, and then the whole piece. And with that, I don't think I have to drag it out much further. We're just gonna roll the outro. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed today's video. The channel is still small, so if you want to help me out, you can drop a like, maybe even a sub. That would be much appreciated. I'm really not a fan of this bagging thing, but everybody else is doing it, so why shouldn't I do it too? We're gonna have one more video, and that's gonna be Balor Darkfang. And we're gonna run into some issues there. But I have these people right here, my patrons, for supporting me and keeping me in an amazing mood, because you guys are just that awesome. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna have another playlist starting very soon, Army on Parades 2024, and we're gonna jump into the future. I see you in the next one. Until then, have a good day and bye bye.